be awesome. Thank you. And thank you, Monica. I am Tanagra Melgarejo. I am part of the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and I am joined today by my colleague and co-facilitator, Laura Guzman, who I'm gonna let her introduce herself in a second, and our colleague Charles Hawthorne, who's also here, providing support, and I'll let Charles introduce themselves in a second. And I come to this work from via Puerto Rico, via Massachusetts. I for many years, more than I would like to say. And I got to HRC 3 years ago, and I am part of the learning and engagement team, providing support to folks across the country that are interested in developing or implementing harm reduction. And this particular topic today, something that I'm really interested in, and I think is really important. I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to talk with you all about it today, and to continue to build knowledge and expertise amongst our community, which you're part of. So I'm going to let Laura introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Guzman, and I actually been associated with the Harm Reduction Coalition for 25 years, almost from its inception. And in the past was a trainer since 1999, and have been mostly honing my practice experience as a provider of housing and homeless services for almost 2 decades. Been in the continuum of care for Alameda County the last 3 years, and joined in February the Harm Reduction Coalition. And I have a particular passion to train around trauma and to raise awareness, what I call trauma awareness, myself as a trauma survivor, and also having trained other trauma survivors. I think is very powerful. It's kind of the beginning of healing, but also very important as we do this work to be extra attentive to knowing how trauma manifests. So I'm really excited about what we're going to be sharing and working together today towards a definition, talking about effects and impact on ourselves. Now I'll pass it to Charles.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charles Hawthorne. I am also part of the Learning and Engagement team at Harm Reduction Coalition. I am a capacity building coordinator. Most of the work that I do is actually based in San Francisco, California. I provide all of the trainings that we do with programs in San Francisco, including trainings like this one. And today I am helping out with tech. So Laura and Tornago are going to be doing most of the facilitating, but I am in the background. So if you have any tech questions or any issues you're having, feel free to shoot me a private message, and I can help you work those out.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I will not go into tons of detail about Harm Reduction Coalition, because you know who we are, but we do all these things, and we are in the process of revamping our website. We just saw a brief preview today, and I am so excited when we get to unveil it. But if you do peruse it now or after we finish our training, and there's something that you're looking for that you can find, please feel free to reach out to me or to Laura or to Charles, and we'd be happy to either find it for you or connect you to the person that may have access to that if we make reference to materials or something that you would be interested in. And I encourage you to peruse it come back to it in August, and you'll see how beautiful it looks. I am very, very excited. Some soon housekeeping, and this made me familiar. I see some faces that I saw the last time. I'm so glad that you're all here. Some housekeeping for us to be mindful of is, please, if you can, turn your camera on. We'd like to see your faces. We love to see your expressions. It's the closest we can get to making this feel like an in-person training, which is one of my most favorite things to do. We're going to ask you, if you're not speaking, to keep your mic muted so that we can lower the background noises, and feel free to unmute your mic if you want to speak. We're also going to ask you to add your pronouns to your name. So I am going to do that by renaming myself. You go to the 3 dots in the little box that we have next where we're in, and then you can just do that. And now you'll see that I renamed myself so we can know which pronouns you prefer us to use. You can also comment, share your thoughts, your ideas, through the chat menu. So please feel free to do that. I wanted to also ask folks that are on this call if you can add your name and your email in the chat box so we can start seeing who's here. That'd be awesome. So I'm not good at multitasking, but I bet you all are, so you can do that while you're listening to the Zoom housekeeping. Please also use the Zoom reaction functions to let us know how this is going. Zoom is kind of biased, so only has positive ones, but if you think something wasn't clear, you can go like this. And if there's something you're like, you can go like this and let us know and we can work through it. We're definitely going to take a break somewhere between like what we think is the halfway point of the training, but we also want to encourage you to take care of yourself. So if before the break you need to stretch or move or stand up or get a cup of coffee, whatever it is that you need to do, please do that. We know that you're still listening. And tech issues will happen. We will just roll with them. Right before this, my internet did something weird. I am crossing my fingers, my toes, everything in my body that it will not do it again. But I had a moment of panic. I was like, no, not today, not today. So if for some reason I disappear, you're in good hands with Laura and Charles, and I will try to come back. But just letting you know that, and also that I have a dog. She's still here for those of you that were here last time, and she still hates the post person. So I don't know what I'm gonna do to make that work. But if she does bark, I apologize in advance for the noise. But you know, she has her feelings and I shouldn't be, you know, preventing her from expressing them. So some thoughts around that. And then today our objectives are the following. We want to develop a collective group definition for this group of trauma and explore the ways in which we see trauma manifest in our work. And we also want to look at those harm reduction principles and how those principles can be applied to a trauma-informed or healing center engaged practice. We also want to explore, you know, when we're thinking of trauma, I'm not a clinician, so the way that I look at this is through a non-clinical lens. But how do I use that knowledge to engage people, you know, and understand also through that lens what is in terms of myself, my positionality and the power that I bring in relationship to folks that have experienced trauma. I have experienced trauma, but when I am in the position of being a case manager or providing direct services or being a program manager, I do have positional power. And that then is something that I have to be mindful of, particularly when we're creating those spaces that we hope are safe for people to bring their full selves in, right? And sometimes bringing our full selves in means that we are expressing and sharing our trauma. And we're going to try to apply some of this theory, right? And see how this may work. And we want to hear from you in the ways that you are applying this work. We know that this is not new to you. And what we're hoping is to create this space for collective conversation today with each other. So I encourage you to use your chat box and use the microphone and talk to us. So we're going to start with the underpinnings, which is the philosophy and the practice of harm reduction. And then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to go into understanding trauma and really unpack that definition of trauma that we're going to build together. And then look at how trauma responses are connected to COVID-19 and how COVID-19 may be bringing up trauma responses for our participants and also for ourselves. And then finally, we'll do a brief grounding, breathing exercise. This is no, Laura no había escuchado esto, she hadn't heard this, but I'm gonna ask Laura to maybe lead us to the breathing niroga exercise at the end, because I think it'll be a good way for us to leave the conversation feeling, you know, connected back to ourselves and to our bodies. So I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm gonna ask you to do that, if that's okay. And now some group agreements. We're gonna ask folks to take space, but also to make sure that you're making space. So for those folks that tend to be shyer, we encourage you to speak up, to share your thoughts, to ask questions. And for those of us that tend to not be shy and always have something to say, talking about me, then I want to make sure that I'm making space so that other folks can take that space up. I also want to encourage us to use I statements. I can only speak for my experience, my reality. I can only own what it's my being myself. And so we want to make sure that we're able to not generalize or draw blanket statements or, you know, create a sense that, you know, everything's the same, because it's not. Different people come to this in different ways and our experiences are different. And I think that's what also is important about building collective knowledge, is feeling safe sharing those and not feeling judged because my experience is not the same or is supposed to be the same as this other person's. The other piece that is important is to think, sometimes we start a thought and the thought keeps going and we're like, what is happening? Where am I going with this? All of a sudden it's like, what was I saying? So why am I still talking? If that happens to you, it has happened to me. It happened to me today and I had to use waste. Why am I still talking? Hold on, I'm gonna stop here. I can't bring my thought back. Maybe it comes back later. It's okay. It happens to us. It's 3 o'clock in the day and, we've had a full day and our brains are a little, they're moving slower. So coffee is always good, but if that doesn't work, we can always waste. The Vegas rule still applies. We want to make sure that this is a safe space. So what is shared in this group, I want us to have the commitment of keeping this a safe space. So what's shared here stays here so that folks can bring their thoughts, their ideas, so that they feel comfortable disclosing information that normally they wouldn't if that wasn't the case. So Vegas rule applies. What's said here stays here. We also want to encourage folks to say it rough or say it ugly. And it's important for us not to censor ourselves. Sometimes we hold back because we feel that what we're saying will not make sense or won't sound great, or I don't have the right language or words to express it. And that's okay. We can say, I'm going to say it rough, right? And we can hold space for each other, and together we can work through it so we can find better language or a better way to articulate it, right? So that's also important. And to assume that we're coming, all of us, from a place of good intention. I'm saying something rough and I'm not meaning to hurt someone, but sometimes it does hurt someone. So I have to be willing also to hear ouch and to hold space for that as well as a collective and to work through it together. And finally, one diva, one mic. Or one mic, right? So make sure, like, although with Zoom, it's kind of hard because, but in a room sometimes, make sure that one person, finishes their thought and then we can go ahead and add or share our experience as well. I want to make sure that those agreements sound good to people. Do we feel comfortable with that? If I can see the thumbs up for folks, yay, good, awesome. I'm going to make sure everything looks good. If there's anything missing, please let us know. You can type it in the chat box and be happy to share it with the group. And so now we're going to an activity and I'm going to ask Charles to kindly annotate for me. And I want to ask you all to share with us, why do you think people use drugs? And you can either use your microphone if you feel comfortable, or you can type it in the chat box. Jasmine says depression. Yes, I see depression repeats itself. Self-medication. Melissa. To cope or to escape. Emily. Elizabeth is sharing with us to fill the void. So, sometimes we feel empty and that's a way to fill up time, to take up space, to do something. Vanessa is sharing anxiety. Absolutely. Those are really good reasons why people use drugs. Can folks think of other reasons why people would use drugs? To enjoy sex. Yes, absolutely. Can you tell us more, Laura?
I think that it has been historically a way to explore and enhance sexual experiences, whether it's alcohol, whether it's speed or meth or cocaine. I think there is a tight relationship in ways in which we may use drugs to really enhance the sexual and loving experience.
And I would add to that, thank you.
Ecstasy is a good example. It got that name for a reason, but in definitely has been something that I always like to point out that is one of the reasons why we use drugs.
Yeah, for me, this inhibits me, uninhibits me, it's how you say it. Like inhibitions go out the window. I feel great. I feel I would do things I normally wouldn't do. I'm not as shy. So drugs are good, are good for that, for making us feel self-confident and good about ourselves. I see that Bill said people use drugs for relief. And if I can ask you, Bill, relief from what? Putting you on the spot. for problems, exactly. So if folks experience problems, it's a way to, you know, to change the way that we view things, to disconnect and disengage from ourselves, right? To go to a different space where those things are no longer in the forefront of our minds, right? So drugs are really good for helping us do that, right? To find, get connected to alternate dimensions, to leave our bodies, to feel at home in another place. We also use drugs for other reasons. For example, to work, right? To stay awake, to stay safe, particularly if you're a female identified person that is unhoused, staying awake. If you're living outside, it's super important, right? So folks may use drugs, stimulants to stay awake. And then when I know I can relax, I may need to use a substance to help me calm down, right? So sometimes it's to relax, to calm myself, to fall asleep, right? To feel warm, not to feel hungry, right? All those are reasons why, you know, folks may use drugs. Going to
Tanagra, I used to, having worked in the HIV/AIDS era in the beginning and worked with people who were both been impacted and dying of AIDS, I learned so much that, for example, meth use was for people to stay focused and energized to actually go to see a case manager in an appointment. So I learned that that was critical for them to be able to focus and do some of the work that was needed to carry through a housing application. And that was something that before I could never imagine. Having migrant workers and workers on the field, same thing. It's like cocaine, usually sometimes a meth at this point is what folks use to be able to work 12 hours, 14 hours under the sun. So
yeah.
things sometimes we don't imagine, but that are really what helps people go through the day.
And I was going to say, added to that, we were in Wyoming and we heard that folks were using stimulants, particularly folks working in oil rigs. They're digging for oil in some parts of Wyoming. So they used a lot of stimulants to stay up and work many, many hours, take many shifts, but then they would get injured. And so then they would look for opioids or other pain medications, you know, to help them be able to cope with the pain so they could take the stimulant so they could stay up, right? So there's many reasons why people, you know, would use drugs, right? And these are some of them. I am going to erase these now, and we're going to move to the next question, which is, why is it that people just don't stop using drugs? Feel free to use, folks have addiction issues or substance use dependency issues, absolutely. Yes, thank you, Jocelyn. Why else? What are we, fear of change, Melissa? Can I put you on the spot and tell me a little bit what you mean by that?
Sure. So change in routine, it's scary. They weren't, you know, some people weren't successful without drugs, and now they have to change, and it's really hard, physically, mentally, to make that change.
100%, right? We folks, you know, we depend, as we saw before, we use drugs for many different reasons. And I see other folks that said people have become dependent on it. They need support. Folks feel safe with them. This is something I know that I use, that I know what's going to make me feel and what is going to help me accomplish, right? And as a coping mechanism, it's something that has always been there or has been there for as long as I've been involved with it and has not failed me. And then we ask people to stop using that coping mechanism, to stop resorting to substance use, but we don't offer them other options to figure out what other ways or other things could help them deal with life differently, right? If substance use gives my life structure and meaning, and I know that when I get up, these are the things that I'm going to do, and then I'm going to go and find something to help me feel well, and then I'm going to go to work, and I'm going to do all these things, and then I'm going to come home, and I'm going to use again so that I can go and rest. Right? I know I have a structure to my day, right? And without that, then what are we offering folks, right? What are the things that we're putting in place, the systems, the services that we're offering folks so that they can safely explore, you know, the possibility of transforming substance use, right? Or if they want to, you know, or developing other ways of navigating stress, tension, trauma, fatigue, that may not necessarily involve drugs, right? And that's also something really important. We don't stop using drugs also because there's brain changes that happen in terms of brain chemistry, right? There's these things called dopamine and serotonin, and what's the other one? Endorphins. All those things happen in our brain, right? They're there. And naturally we produce them. And I'm not a scientist, as I said, so this is not a scientific definition of that. But all those things are there, right? And then we use substances, and substances go into those receptors, and we fool the brain to say, oh, the substance is now there to make us feel that way. So if I don't use the substance, my brain got lazy because it didn't have to produce them, right? And no longer produces them. So I may not feel good, not because only, because I stopped using substances, but also because my brain may not necessarily be able to produce those things the way that it was producing them before I stopped using substances. So we're asking folks to stop using substances that they're gonna feel really crappy, right? Not to say the palabra en español, me voy a sentir como caca. I'm not gonna feel good, right? And my brain's not gonna feel good because, I have to help it get to that place again, or may not be able to get there, but as good as it was, or close to how it was before. And that's something that, you need, to have therapy and access to resources, right? To be able to get to that place. And sometimes our participants don't have that, right? So I don't want to feel crappy, so I'm not going to stop using, right? So it's consistency. I see Jen saying that as well. Any other thoughts?
There's, I think it was, who added it? Jasmine added, they feel they depend on them. It's interesting to contrast with physical dependence. Someone brought dependence. In harm reduction, we say addiction is a much more complicated way to define what that means. But dependence is some drugs, you become physical dependent, such as opiates. However, a lot of stimulants, you become psychologically dependent. So the feeling of dependence is there, even though the drug itself, it's not something that the body is depending on, but now it's sort of the feeling that I need. So that distinction is real important.
Absolutely, yeah, and both are very valid, right? And if we don't have a safe space to talk about that, if we don't have a safe space to explore that and to say, wow, this is my fears behind this, right? I had a friend that for many, many years, wanted to stop using drugs. And when he quit, he told me the hardest thing to quit was not the actual quitting itself. It was the fact that I felt that by quitting, I was turning my back on a community of people that when my parents kicked me out at 15 because I came out as gay, picked me up, kept me safe, loved me, cared for me, were my friends and my family. And that's something I did also with them. This piece was a little piece of everything that I got from them. And by stopping or choosing to change my relationship to drugs, it meant that maybe I couldn't be with them anymore. And that was really scary to me because I didn't know how else to relate to them. And I had to figure that out, right? And so that just to me, such a good example of what Laura, you were bringing, and Jasmine and other folks, right, into the conversation. So thank you for that. And now we're going to see, I'm narrating what I'm doing, but I also realized I'm a narrator. So now we're going to think about, the conversation about harm reduction, right? So people use drugs for the same reasons that they don't stop using drugs, right? They're the same reasons. And harm reduction is the tool, it's a framework, it's a philosophy that allows us to create safe spaces for conversation where we can unpack that, right? When we can talk to participants about the motivations behind their substance use, the reasons behind their substance use, right? What they get from it, what they like about it, the things that sometimes prevent them from stopping, or the choices that they're making in terms of shifting and changing their use in a way in which we're not putting judgment on it, but we're understanding it from an objective perspective, right? I'm not asking, you don't ask someone if they are planning on quitting X medication, right? Right. And so thinking about, an inhaler or thinking about harm medication. So it's the same thing. So we're having a conversation about, how is this working for you and what are the options that you think you have? And I may have some others that I want to share. So it's incorporating all those strategies to help people stay safe. And that means safer techniques for use. It means managed engagement, and it means also abstinence. So I want to make clear that harm reduction believes in abstinence. Abstinence is part of the harm reduction spectrum. But we don't believe in abstinence being imposed. Because I don't know about you, but whenever someone has forced me to do something, it hasn't really worked out that well, right? in the short term complied, got what I wanted, and then went back to doing the same behavior I was doing before because it didn't really feel that it was something I wanted to do, right? I hadn't made that choice yet. It was made for me. So we believe in abstinence when people feel that they're ready to engage in abstinence and that they're willing and ready to explore it in a way that makes sense for them. Harm reduction is also a framework that allows us to understand structural inequalities, right? The ways that racism, poverty, homophobia, misogyny intersect in people's lives and experiences and may create not only harms, but barriers to access to services, right? That may, in fact, in some ways, be the reasons behind someone's use, right? If I'm someone who's constantly surveilled, when I live in a community it's isolated or that is discriminated, I'm criminalized by just being a member of that community, and I am in fear of dying every day if I go into the street, to me, it makes sense that people may explore substance use as a way to escape that reality, right? And so it's thinking about how those things intersect. How is it that we disproportionately think that young Black and Latino men are immediately suspicious versus seeing, white men walking in the street, right? Like just thinking about those things. And also the idea that we want to meet people where they're at, but we're not leaving them there. And that is important because for many years I thought I was doing that and I realized I wasn't, because I was meeting people where they're at because I was bringing them to me, but I wasn't really going to where they were at. I was still in my mind making them do what I felt was right for them. And I had to realize that, in order to meet someone where they're at, you have to be really vulnerable, right? And you have to allow yourself to sit in the space that is really uncomfortable, which is I am not in control of this situation. I am not the expert in this experience because it's not my experience, it's this participant's experience. And I need to learn from them what they need and what works for them. And then I can share my resources. I can share my expertise. I can share the things that I bring to the table, but ultimately I am the co-pilot. I am not the driver of the car, right? I need to feel comfortable letting people make choices that would not be the choices I make. And that's fine because this is not about Tanagra. This is about the participant. Does that make sense? If you have thoughts or questions, please write them down in the chat. We want to hear from you as well. And so harm reduction is fabulous because it allows us to do all these things. It allows us to focus on concrete steps. And I don't know for you, but when I was doing case management, one of the things that felt really overwhelming was that we wanted to change all these things. And we had to address all these things. And it felt like this amorphous ball of things that was bigger than us, bigger than many other things. And something that helped me was that I could change one thing. I could try to address one thing and focus on those concrete steps that we decided together with the participant. The participant chose which steps they wanted to work on. And together we focused on those and we worked on that. And that allows us to gain trust, build rapport, and develop resiliency and self-confidence, right? We're working with folks that have been told that they're not smart, that they're not capable, folks that have been forgotten and not seen. So creating a space where people are able to put things into practice safely and develop that sense of self-confidence is super important. And harm reduction allows us to do that through focusing on those concrete steps. It's also important in order to focus on those concrete steps that we center participant needs and wants, right? This is not necessarily about me, although, I, as a provider, have some things that I have to bring to the table, right? I have deliverables that I have to meet. And there's things that as an organization, we're asked to, work on, right? We get funding and grants for a reason. And it's important for us to make sure that we're sharing that in the most transparent way possible so we can see how what the participant wants and what I have to do can come to the same plane. Right? And I think sometimes that's very much possible and sometimes it's not, but that's okay because we are expressing that to the participant and they're aware of that because we're sharing exactly what we have to do and why. So they understand and it doesn't seem arbitrary, right? Sometimes I think what participants used to say to me was like, why didn't you explain that to me before that way? Because now, I don't agree with it, but at least I respect you and I understand why. I don't want it, I don't like it, but I get it. I get that, it's a necessary part of this process. And so once I realized that explaining things transparently allowed for people to trust me, I started doing that, right? As much information as I had, I shared with the participants, and I work with them to make those decisions. So I was in a way trying to maintain participant autonomy. I wanted them to have all the information that they could have so that they could make the most informed choice they could make. And I know for me, when I've been in a situation where I have felt that I don't have all the information, I completely disengage, right? And I think that all of us may have experienced that at some point or another. I think of that very much when I go to the doctor. When the doctor is like, oh, don't worry about that. You just have to take this pill. And I'm like, but wait a minute, what do you mean? It's not your body. You're not the one who's taking the pill. I want to understand. I'm not being difficult. I just want to know what this would do to my body. What's the cost? How long I have to take it so that I can make an informed decision, right? Because if I don't have that information, I don't know what may happen. And then my liver gets shot, but I really went because I wanted to deal with my back pain. Then, I may not want to, I don't want to risk those odds, right? So I want to make sure that I can maintain autonomy in that process. And our participants deserve the same.
And I wanted to, as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking those of us who worked in housing and services, this is where it's so important. I remember our team doing case, I know that many of you do case conferencing. Some of you are trying to get people placed in rapid rehousing with minimal supports. Others may be trying to place folks in settings that are a lot of supports that may not go with what the client wants. And I remember my team creating all these plans, and then we forgot to ask, what does the client want? Mm-hmm. This very simple question that we forget, because we always have better ideas about what the clients want. And this is, it's part of the work of how we do it. We were talking 2 weeks ago, when we met a week ago, this is a major cause of stress. It's like, I have an idea about what the client wants. Well, what we're learning in harm reduction is you can have great ideas, but if we don't understand fully what the client wants, and knowing that the client may want something that might be impossible, having that perspective is really important, because that's where we get sick and tired. We were talking about, I think there was a difference between, I think that's more like, I don't think that vicarious trauma, I think that one is we're putting on our own, because I think that we forget to know that if we're not clear about what the clients want, the choices and the options, however limited, we might actually not moving forward that, assisting that person at that moment. So that's one thing that I always remember that I learned in harm reduction. It doesn't matter what I want if I don't know what my client wants. And the team can have a lot of great ideas, but if it's not aligned with what the client wants, you will never move that, help that client forward or move that case forward.
100%. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that also brings us to thinking about, not only really centering the participant or the client and really asking truly, because we want to know what they want, and in that way also maintaining participant autonomy and being committed to that, but also being flexible, right? Being flexible to try things out, to create a safe space for a participant. I may know what I want today. If you ask me what I want right now, it's I want another cup of coffee, which may not be a good idea because I've had 3 already. And yet I may want another cup of coffee after we're done because I have to do like 4 hours of work afterwards, right? And yet, maybe I need to be flexible. I need to think maybe I should have some tea and I should try that out and see how that worked for me, because maybe some tea is better than, it will give me that perk that I need, but it's not as, intense as caffeine, right? Or coffee. And so being flexible and feeling safe coming back and saying, you know what, I tried that out, that you mentioned, that didn't work out for me. And for us to say as providers, you know what, it's okay, we can try something else out. Or how do you feel? What do you want to do? Because not even that, maybe they don't want to try anything else. Saying, what would you like to do? How that felt? How can I support you, right? Asking those questions. And also acknowledging barriers, right? Sometimes participants know, I had a participant that she knew what she needed and I knew what she needed because she had told me. And I couldn't get that for her because there were structural barriers that didn't allow us for that to happen because it didn't exist in Puerto Rico, right? So I had to be really honest with her and to really acknowledge what you are telling me you want and what I am seeing you that would benefit you. It doesn't exist here. So let's look at what does exist and see if that would make sense for you now until we figure out a way to ask for that, right? And so it's really acknowledging that there's structural barriers and that we cannot close our eyes and say they are not there because they are, and our participants experience them every day, and you as their support and advocate probably experience them too, right? So it's really thinking about that, and how do we, again, build those spaces that feel safe for someone to share with us, because we want to listen what they think and feel, right? And also, you know, if we think about harm reduction, harm and housing first, right? These are things that we think are in alignment, right? Harm reduction asks us to look at the health and dignity of participants, right? To really center what they think is healthy for them, and to treat people with dignity and respect, right? And we think that low threshold access to housing is a way to address people's health and dignity, right? It's to get you into housing if that's what you want, without the least amount of barriers possible for you to be able to get there, right? Like, we're asking folks to think about housing first, right? And its embodiment as a way of, you know, of creating that for people. We're thinking of participant-centered services, as Laura was saying before, and we're thinking that that translates to us as individually driven voluntary services, right? I worked at a program where all services had to be voluntary. And what I did was, what I used to say was like, yo las voy a hacer que se enamoren. I'm gonna talk about the services in a way that is gonna make them fall in love with the services and be willing to explore them. But no one was penalized if they chose not to engage in any other service, that it was just not their housing. Some of them said to me, you know what? All I need is a house, an apartment. I have that, I'm fine. And that was fine. And then we said, okay, so how frequently do you think we should just get in touch? Because that's a requirement for us, that we need to know how you're feeling and where you're at. And they would drive that. And there were other people that, after we talked about the services, they said, sure, I'll explore them. But no one was penalized, whether they chose or not chose. By that, their housing wasn't taken away. We worked with them, and some of them said no in the beginning, and eventually months later, a year later, said, you know what, that looks cool what you're doing, I want to try it out. You know, so eventually some of them did, and that was great too. And then finally, participant involvement, which is, I worked with participants, and when we were working on their work plans, valga la redundancia, the redundancy, we were developing their work plans, we worked together. They drove that process. We looked at what they wanted to accomplish. We looked at the deliverables I had to provide, and together we came up with a plan. And that to us means that you're honoring choice and self-determination, which is also part of housing first principles, right? So you're honoring people's choice and self-determination as much as you can in the process. You are getting them engaged, because if people feel listened to and heard and seen, people feel connected, and folks are more willing to put effort and work into something, because they own it, right? It's like, it's not the same if it's not yours. But if folks truly believe that this is mine, folks will be there, you know, and they're trusting you and willing to take more risks, you know, in a safe way, right? In terms of like sharing and disclosing their experiences and their thoughts. Does that make sense? Do you see the connection? Folks gonna go like this if you do, if you don't like this, so we know.
If I may, I know some folks in the call are from Abode, but I know, for example, Abode Services, that's an incredible work in placing people in, you know, rapid rehousing. And if it doesn't work, you guys gonna try to find another landlord. And then if that doesn't work, and I know that is really an incredible amount of work, but I know that at the end, that really may yield on the right housing placement for someone. So that's an example, I feel, of how I know some of you as providers are doing this work, rather than saying, hey, this is all we have. You're out of, you know, and even though our choices are so limited, your choices of placements are so limited, still are working to try to find that. Same with special pops, right? Working with youth, those of you who work with youth, you know that it might take a while for the young adult to figure out what would be a placement that is appropriate, knowing also that we have so little resources for youth. So those are examples that I feel are things that I know you're doing every day.
Thank you. And so thinking about what would be some risk factors that surround drug use. What would be some of the things that when you think of drug use, you could think, wow, this could be something that could be risky for someone. And you can chat them, or you can unmute your mic and let us know.
And some of you have different roles, so it might be different for those of you who do housing from those of you who do outreach. We're interested to know in which ways do you see those risk factors?
well, one of the risk factors in some programs could be the loss of housing, right? For some folks that are in housing where substance use is not something that, you know, they don't have policies that in consider that as a possibility. So for some folks that could be one. Employment, right? Loss of employment for some folks as well. What else?
Melissa says getting in situations where clients are behaving risky. Do you want to share a little bit more?
Yes, I've had some clients that were actually actively using drugs, and I would have to take them to the doctor, and they would get into, you know, into it with the doctor. And then one time, this doctor was not being helpful or understanding this person anyway. And so, I mean, the police were almost called, but I kind of, you know, de-escalated the situation, and we got out of there before the police were called. But yeah, I've been in that situation a few times.
So having to navigate structures and systems that don't understand substance use and that put people in the defensive and harm them, and also having the police or their criminals involved with the criminal justice system in a way that then becomes more harmful. That's a risk factor. And we know for some people that means death, right? And so thank you for sharing that, because that's really real. And then being in the situation of having to be in the el jamón del sandwich, right? Be in the middle, trying to de-escalate and trying to like navigate the situation and like support the participant, and also, you know, get this other provider, you know, to a place where they're not harming the person that we came in. Thank you for sharing that, because that sounds like a sticky situation, right? Absolutely. Any other thoughts around, you know, what are some risk factors that surround drug use? Like if you think about, you know, what could be the risk factors for people's health, for example? So for example, if you use drugs, it could be HIV, Hep C, particularly if you're injecting or you're, you know, using, creating, you know, any kind of hormone in your body, you can get sepsis, you can get abscesses. Also, if you are using substances, you have pre-existing health conditions, you know, that could also, substance use in some ways can aggravate some of that. That could be, you know, a risk factor associated with that. Particularly also if you're using polysubstance use, where you're using substances that have not been prescribed for you or that you're buying outside in the market, right? And then you have medication that has been prescribed to you. I had a participant whose mental health medication wasn't working, and she kept trying to say that to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatra wouldn't listen. The psychiatrist was, oh, you just gotta wait for it. And she's like, I've been waiting a year. I've been telling you this doesn't feel good. It doesn't work. It's just making it worse. And so she decided that she found out that using a particular substance, you know, helped her deal with the side effects and what wasn't working. It made her feel better. So she started using it. And then they found out and they punished her. They kicked her out. They just, you know, immediately didn't want to see her because they couldn't see someone who was actively using substances. And I called him back and I said, I know that for a year she's been trying to tell you that's the whatever medication regime that you have for her, it doesn't work. And you haven't listened. You have done nothing to help her. And she's only seen you 3 times in that year. And the people that she has seen have not conveyed that to you. So don't throw her out or kick her out of a program because she has not got her needs met and you haven't met those needs. And I, as a doctor that you are, I am going to write a letter to the doctor board, and something's going to happen if you don't reconsider the, you know, and I want her seen by another doctor. I don't want her seen by you either. Right. And so she asked me to do that, and I was able to support her in advocacy with that. But that was a risk factor, right? For her health, her well-being, physical and emotional health and well-being. Right. So there's many risk factors that we can encounter with substance use. Right. And if we add COVID to that, like, what would be the impact of those risk factors? What would be the impact of someone, you know, experiencing mental, emotional health conditions and then having this thing come up, right? Like COVID and come into our lives, right? For many people that I've talked to, I have someone very near and dear to me who said, you know what, like I have for many years used a set of coping mechanisms and tools and techniques to help me stay in a place of sobriety that I've chosen. And those things have worked okay, but now that COVID is in the picture, those things are no longer working for me. And I am feeling increasingly guilty that they're not working for me and scared, because I feel that this thing that I don't know how to deal with because no one prepared me to deal with it, it's completely decentering me in a way that feels really harmful and scary. And I feel I cannot talk to anyone about it, because then immediately everybody's alarm bells are gonna go off and they think I'm gonna pick up, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I need someone to help me figure out, how to explore other things. At least verbalize my feelings in a way that feels safe without someone immediately jumping on and saying, oh, I have to watch you. And because, somehow you're going to go back to using, because that's not what was concerning them, right? Like there were other issues there. So thinking about how COVID-19 can impact people's ability to stay safe, right? How it can create, impact you as providers, right? How has it impacted you in your work, for example? Can someone share some examples of that? I can, if you're trying to speak, Melissa, tap muted.
I was repeating the question to myself. And the question, yes, how it impacts me is that we're working from home and everything is all, like I said I think I shared this last time, that everything the day, I sometimes don't even know the day because it all together. So it really impacts me, in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it impacts you emotionally and physically and mentally. And for those of you that have to work directly with participants, how has it shifted or changed the way that you meet with people, that you engage people in conversation, that you hold those office hours for people? And she is barking. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The postman is there.
My visits are very limited. And I have to go through a whole routine, making them wear gloves, myself wear gloves, it's very limited. And it's very routine, so it's very impacted in that way.
Yeah, so we can't do the things that we used to do before, right? And that way we've had to create a new whole system that we're all trying out to figure out how this works. And that ability to develop rapport or to create safe spaces for people in a physical sense, right, has shifted and changed. Right now, we don't want to harm other people by exposing them to COVID, but we also want to keep ourselves safe and protected, right? So there's this underlying degree of tension from everybody. We have all of our antennas out, right? And that degree of tension and constant anxiety that a lot of folks are experiencing also translates to our work, right? And translates in the ways that we feel available emotionally and physical, right? To be able to connect. And I see that Jasmine is saying that she needs to see people, right? We want to see our participants. We want to connect with them. Can you tell me more, Jasmine, a little bit about that? How's that been for you?
I get a little anxiety when I'm working from home sometimes. So I try to I've been trying to connect with my clients and going at least outside their homes, just I just need to interact because I just need to be with people. I can't be in in four walls, siento que no puedo respirar,
I hear you.
Yeah.
I know, it's real, right? And people appreciate us doing that. And also sometimes when we're working with participants that may not have a permanent space that they're living in, or they're in that transition, even finding them is hard, right? Because folks are trying to, they may not be able to the same places, and we may not be able to go there. And so all those limitations certainly, they're things that are making us not breathe, added to the COVID fear, right? Which is there, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Any other ideas in terms of how, COVID-19 may impact risk factors for people in terms of thinking about health, substance use that you can think of?
Teresa, I know that I have a client that she's housed, but she's been super successfully housed for almost a year. And from almost the I would say within a month of the shelter in place, it all went really south. And it was because she couldn't do her group meetings that she was going to. Like she kind of opened up to these after many months of being resistant. And then when she started doing it, she was like really benefiting. And then suddenly she's like closed in, can't do groups, doesn't understand Zoom, felt really isolated. And I mean, she's digging back out, but it's like just to see her not be, and then she would call and was upset because we wouldn't come and see her. But again, we didn't want to, in the beginning of COVID, none of us really knew how we were navigating. And she's old, you know, she's a little in the older vulnerable group. So that made it really difficult because she took it personally that we weren't seeing her.
Yeah.
But I know that COVID is really, with some of the folks who do rely on group meetings or, you know, for mental health, it definitely, I'm seeing that being affected.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That's a really concrete example also of that kind of disruption that happens to people's routine, which gives you safety. And then that disruption happens and you feel isolated and alone and you don't know how to connect, or, you know, you're used to connecting in a certain way and there's no other resources available, or the ones that are not necessarily, there's barriers to those, right? They're not available as we would want. And then that can set off someone into a spiral that it's really hard, right? Because we watch someone and we know this works for them. It's worked for them until that point, right? So how do we support them within the constraints of what we're experiencing to be able to get back to a place where they feel good again, right? And that's challenging for them, but also as providers and people that care about them, is challenging for us too, right? And we want to say F COVID, right? Because damn it, you know, and it's here and it's going to be here for a while. And how do we explain to folks also that this thing that we don't see and we don't touch can be really lethal and dangerous, right? And that's another added piece. So we're dealing with all these different layers, right, of risk factors to participants and to ourselves. And I want to appreciate, you know, very much for you sharing that and other folks that have shared. And I want to introduce a model that we use to help us have these kinds of conversations, right, about risk, but looking at risk outside of only thinking about drugs at the risk. And it's called drug set setting. And this was a model that it's based on a study by Dr. Simberg. He carried out a long-term study of folks that returned from the Vietnam War. And when I said long-term, it was 30 years. And he started looking at them, and these were people that had identified as people, you know, they denied that they used drugs in Vietnam to cope, and they came back, and he wanted to see what would happen. And within the period that they came back, many of them, I would say almost like 90%, stopped using drugs, right? And one of the reasons behind that they gave him was, I no longer need to, because the conditions changed, the setting, the space they were in changed. I'm no longer in a war. I no longer have to feel that I'm killing people and deal with the consequences of killing another human being or having to hear and witness that and the trauma that brings. So the setting shifted. I'm no longer in Vietnam or no longer there. So I'm here now, and I feel that helped. Also the set, you know, my mindset has shifted. I no longer have to escape or fear those things. I have support systems that allow me to process and get support to navigate the outcomes of those situations, so I can get therapy. I have family. I have support systems from friends, right? All those two things changed, and their substance use changed, right? So they were able to transform the way that they connected to the substance because the set and the setting changed. And so when we think of substance use, you know, most of the time we only focus on the drug that the person is using. And although that's really important information to have for the reasons we talked about before, because we want to explore the potential dangers of polysubstance use, whether the drug is prescribed or not prescribed, whether they're the mode of that they're using the drug, whether it's injection or smoking or, you know, or snorting, whether they're using it alone or collectively. Those things are important. And, you know, those things are not the only causes of harm. Sometimes you can use drugs in a very safe way if your set and setting is safe too, right? If I'm in the right mindset versus, you know, feeling that I am displaced. And for example, how do you feel, what's your mindset when you're at home and you get home after a day of work, or you transition from work and you decide to have a glass of wine, right? Let's say, how do you feel? Or a beer, or a michelada, or a mimosa, or any of that, if you drink, like, how would that feel? How does that make you feel? Being at home, kicking off your heels or your tennis shoes and clicking on Netflix and spending the night in. Relaxed, yes, we feel relaxed, feel calm, right? We're chill, right? Let's think about now, how do you feel when you're getting ready to go out on a Friday night to the club or to the pub when we can in the past, and you're going to meet friends and you're going to hang out with them? How does that feel?
Exciting.
Exciting, right? Thrilling. I'm like, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna see my friends, I'm gonna have fun, I'm gonna dance, I'm gonna connect, right? So it's the same substance. We're gonna drink alcohol, but the setting is different, and our relationship and what that substance does for us is different, right? And so that's part of what I love about this gift that Simber gave us, is that it allows us to really understand that, we're asking people to stop using drugs, and that may not be possible if their setting doesn't change, right? If those conditions stay and remain the same, and we don't work around those things with people, and we ask them what they need and center them, then they won't, their substance use may not change, right? It will be challenging for them to change it. Do you think this is something that you find you could use with your participants? Yeah, I see some. So know that you're gonna get the information and the materials, and I encourage you to use them. I've used it a lot with participants, and it's been really helpful to unpack what people's motivations, thoughts, desires are behind their substance use, and also to think about, if those shift, then what would be the things that they would want and need from that process to be able to get there and to make those changes. See.
Tanera, one thing I love about drug set and setting, for those of us who've been using the model, is also that Dr. Simber really challenged the concept of once an addict, always an addict, or
yes.
once an alcoholic, because he was able to prove that actually the relationship to heroin, even though it's a drug that creates physical dependency, it really was very different according to how people cope the drug, in what context. So the setting and also the set. So it's a great way to also challenge notions of addiction that sometimes are very laden with, we laden our clients like, he's an addict, he's an alcoholic, and might not have a direct relationship to an actual diagnosis. So that's another reason why we love to sort of challenge notions that we know that have been researched and shown not to be true.
And the other thing, thank you for reminding me that, is that Dr. Simberg also thought that people would stop, if they stop using substances, they would need to go to treatment or do all these things. And many people just stopped on their own, right? Once they had that setting shift, they were able to build those supports, and they didn't necessarily need to adhere to treatment or even seek treatment to change the nature and dynamic of their relationship to the substance. So that to me was also really enlightening. Thank you for helping me think of that. And now I think we should take a break, if that's okay with folks. See?
We have half an hour. We'll take 5 this time. Is that okay?
Sure, we can take 5 minutes and go stretch, drink water. I don't know if it gives you time to brew coffee, and then we'll be back a las 4:05. 4:05? See? You get 6. See you in a minute, or 5 minutes.
All right, let's roll it. So I want to make sure that we finish as we promised at 4:30. So given that we have 30 minutes, we're going to be a little more brief on the definition, but then we'll together do it in the group. So if there is any need for clarification, we'll do it after. And as I started today, I said it's so important as we talk about trauma is actually to get to have deeper understandings of what trauma is. And I like this idea of having the 3 E's. What are the events? What are the experience of the events and the effects that trauma has? Because last week we talked about stress. And I remember that Tanagra moved us from our regular stress, this idea that we are still actually, as human beings, our brain is pretty much seeking threat generally, but we have this stress kind of continuum that can become toxic stress. in some ways, trauma has its own category. I call it traumatic stress. And so in a second, we'll talk more about why that particular stress is different. And the definition here comes from SAMHSA, is the idea that individual trauma results from an event or series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functional and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And I love to just put some of you may have seen it already. I like to put my trauma lenses, because the way I describe how trauma manifests is that trauma lives in the body and in our reactions, a particular way in which we see reality that not everybody else may see it the same way. And I always like to really emphasize that, because sometimes when we don't know how to handle, or we condemn about people's trauma's reactions, are exactly what trauma causes. And so sometimes the slightest question that you may ask, or the slightest change of tone, can make someone really go all in and feel agitated and act in particular bizarre ways and yell and scream. All of the things that sometimes we see, sometimes ourselves, but definitely the folks that we work, those are all the direct effect of trauma. So we can go to the next one. This idea that there's structural, historical, and intergenerational trauma, I think that is important to notice that not only individuals, but communities can be experiencers of trauma. And I think we started last week saying that in some ways, vicarious trauma is an experience that we share as providers in witnessing the individual or collective trauma of the folks that we serve. But also that there is intergenerational trauma that we talk a lot, and oppression trauma or racism is a good example of it, but also within families itself. You know, there might be generations of sexual abuse, or, you know, incest and early child sexual abuse through generations. That's another example. And it's very interesting to also say that trauma, even though it fits in the mental illness, trauma is really not a mental illness. Why is that? What is trauma, really? Who can tell me? Why it's not a mental illness, even though it's in the manual? Anybody? You can let's try. It's not a tricky question. I'll just say it, only because we have little time. It's because it's something that was brought upon to us, to ourselves. And the only difference between natural disaster and trauma that happens in communities and individuals is that actually the impact and the effects are bigger when people go through trauma perpetrated by people closest to us, like those of us who are incest survivors or sexual abuse, you know, trauma survivors, versus war versus a tsunami. So it's very interesting to know that even within the experiences of trauma, the way that our body reacts is the same, but the intensity is different. I always call it, the closer the person that has perpetrated the abuse, the more that the impact and the effects will be really magnified and get big. Is this making sense? For those of us who have that experience, or those of us who have witnessed it. And I'm gonna just couple of things about the impacts of trauma that I think are very interesting as we go into the exercise. There is this idea that it's an inescapable shock. So when we have been traumatized, our body's gonna react. And that's why there is a great book, I don't know how many of you may have read or heard, it's called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. And I'm gonna write it here. It was for me, it was a pivotal book to learn about my own trauma, but also because he's one of the prominent psychiatrists that challenged everyone else in the United States about what trauma was really like. The Body Keeps the Score. And I'll describe Dr. van der Waals' last name in a second. we're stuck on fight or freeze. So remember we talk about fight or flight. It's fight or flight, freeze for some of us 24/7. For some of us might be in particular situations when we encounter situations that would trigger the event. The entire organism is impacted, body, mind, brain. So it's very important. That's why it's very important to know that all of those things are really impacted. In some ways, our body is defending against a threat that is no longer existing, but it is perceived by us as if it was still here and real. So those are the kind of like the, in a synopsis, what are the impacts of trauma? And so it has long-lasting impact. And one thing I was gonna say when we were talking about drug use and we're talking about Zimber, Dr. Zimber and drug set and setting is for those of us with trauma histories, our relationship with drugs and with other addictive or coping mechanisms can be so strong that those are probably the hardest to really break because they keep us together, staying away from that trauma. I'm gonna leave it at that so we can do the exercise together and then we can wrap up more with, and someone has a question, can food addiction fall into this? I will say any coping mechanism that keep us focused at keeping the body safe, not feeling the feelings that makes us feel terrible. So it could be food, it could be relationships, it could be substances as we talk. I mean, food can be a, you know, it could be substances that are keeping us away from that memory. And when we come back after the exercise, I'll say a couple more things about how fascinating it is of how we store that memory in the body, not in the brain.
So
How did that happen? No, I didn't mute myself. Just wonder if a couple of people want to share some physical reactions again that they witnessed and that are clear manifestations of a trauma response from yourselves or others. Let's just give a couple, anybody. Melissa, do you want to share? I'm going to put Melissa on the spot. She had.
Yes, I actually personally experienced trauma and PTSD. This was about 5 years ago, and I was treated and doing well for, you know, a long time, for 5 years. And I started, you know, just everything that's going on. I started physically shaking. And so I'm going back to, you know, therapy and my psychiatrist. It's just to check out why is this physical shaking? I'm not manifesting any, you know, I'm used to stress, you know, I mean, like, but now it's coming out on my body, you know, because I'm kind of keeping it, having to have to keep it under wraps, you know, so.
Anybody else that wants to either share a physical or emotional reaction or the impact of COVID, particularly as a trauma response?
I had a participant who, when they were feeling really overwhelmed, they would take their cigarette and they would burn their skin a little bit. It was a way for them to come back to their body, to like get grounded. And I had another participant who used to pull her hair in the same spot. And I knew when she was stressed, she'd be like, look. When trauma was resurfacing, she would show me, she'd be like, you know, like I've been pulling. And so, you know, that was another like physical reaction to trauma that I would see. That was just really concrete about like them trying to get back into their body.
And we talk in our group that, I mean, I share for me is becoming absolutely, I cannot move. So you might see this association, a person answers you yes, no, but otherwise they're not there. This idea of disembodying. For me, it's like I cannot move. And so I can barely talk and I can just not move. My body stays. So in the freeze state, I kind of see what's happening. I start getting freaky. And then one interesting thing about crying, we were talking about intense crying. Crying can break the anxiety. Crying can actually help at that moment. So I break the freeze, the freeze aspect and fight aspect, because crying actually gets your energy down. I think that there is other stuff that is important. For example, we're talking about all trauma is pre-verbal, how people talk or not talk, how people yell. When I do de-escalation trainings, I say when people are yelling, it's a symptom that the person is really going through a crisis, and perhaps the yelling is actually a showing that the person is having a traumatic response.
I wanted to say about that. I had a participant who would scream, and I said to her, in our space, it's okay for you to scream. Like, I know what you're screaming. You can scream all you want. We can have a screaming, like, I can put a timer and you can scream. And I want to think about what that would look like in other contexts if you were experiencing this. And one of the things that we helped was for her to work through tapping. And we brought someone that could teach us all tapping, and I can share that. It's a technique that helps you to, like, and you can do tapping without necessarily no one knowing what it is. And instead of screaming in the courthouse, she would do her tapping when she was feeling like she learned to recognize when it was coming on. And then she was able to do her tapping. So she kept screaming with me because it felt safe. And she had another tool she could use, but that was like an emotional reaction you were talking about that made me think of that.
So we can move. I think what Tanagra is bringing up, and we're not going to have the time in this training, is this was my experience working in a drop-in center, but later in housing, is in our housing homeless field, there's so much more work we can do to really figure out what works in working with our folks who have histories of trauma in ourselves. Because oftentimes we do a lot of talk things, talk therapy, talk this, talk that, and really in the body, as we tried it last week, and we're just talking about stress. But the body, whether it's drumming, tapping, actually a lot of the breathing exercises have been more and more showing that has the potential for healing more than any talk therapy that I've done the last 55 years. So I think that there's a lot of potential to do more work around how do we figure out this concept that it's kind of new. A lot of people talk about trauma-informed care, but me and Tanagra have discovered what it's called healing center engagement. So it's kind of moving from the idea that to address people with trauma is just a one-on-one thing, which of course, like Melissa was talking about going to her therapist, I talk about having a rash and treating my rash. But also I'm thinking about those of you who talk about being in community as being a healing process. The idea is that, interestingly enough, trauma affects communities, and also the way that we react is very similar for those people with trauma histories. That it's very important to think about how can we heal in community and actively, rather than just think about how we can each of us individually get, which some of us will have more ability than others to get our individual trauma therapy or therapies. I also think that it moves us from thinking about this idea of what happened to you to what's right with you. So really come from a strength-based, again, a very harm reductionist way of asking people, which is also like, what will help you right now? Always focusing about what can I do right now to get that person, to get that, that level of agitation and trauma response to feel a little safer. It's all about feeling threatened at that moment. And really get trauma survivors to be actual participants on the, creation of well-being. And this is really important in all the work we do. I feel like when we do groups, figuring out how can a group really engage, both in trauma education. We did at the drop-in center that I managed, we did a lot of trauma education. We had our women's group. We will do, I actually did my trauma presentations and talking about the body and really being very, allowing that space, but also allowing space to do things together to really mobilize that trauma. Oftentimes, sometimes groups that are talk therapy, they stay in circles rather than to really mobilize. I think there's a lot of movement right now in youth programs, in youth of color that are actually, the youth themselves are saying, can we just do some shit instead of talking about this shit? So how can we move to really, some of the, rebellion uprising that is going on right now, spaces for conversations, you know, about anti-racist and, you know, all of the conversations around policing and alternatives to police. How can we create communities? This can all be really incredible ways to address trauma, even if you don't have a licensed social worker in your team. And I have to say, I had both. I used to have in my program people who had training. We did one-on-one, but the most healing that we always heard was all of our holiday parties. We did, you know, celebrations that were sometimes birthday celebrations, graduations for our little internships. I think that what we got reported, those were the moments that our folks coming to City Hall to protest when they wanted to cut our budgets. That was our favorite. That was the way that people really felt they were considered, involved, and that was the process of healing. And I don't know if there's anything as we're closing you want to add to this, Tanagra, because I also know this is a big piece of how you want to move our trauma healing forward.
No, I think that you've said it really beautifully. It's about, you know, really looking at people as human beings, that we have the capacity to heal, that we have there's nothing really wrong. Like, you know, it's not what's wrong with you, what's their strengths that you bring. What is it that you have that it makes you be who you are? And that this experience that you happen doesn't define you necessarily. It impacts you, and how we shift that perception and really center people's ability to define and decide what they need, and thinking about, you know, healing as partnership, as treating people with dignity and respect, all the things that we talk about in harm reduction, you know, belief in their knowledge, skills, and confidence, seeing the person. And I think you said this beautifully, and not people's behaviors, right? Which sometimes is like, we center on like, oh, this is what this person is doing, but why? What's behind that, right? Why is this person screaming in this moment? What's happening, right? Also recognizing that a lot of the times, because people are not working from a healing-centered environment or engagement with people, that we stigmatize behaviors that scare us, and we don't understand that further stigmatization just harms people further. And sometimes it's just asking. You know, I had that participant and I said, so how does it make you feel when you scream? Like, how does that help you? And that caring curiosity, because I had that relationship with her that she could say, I'm just letting it all out. I'm just like, it's like, I feel like if I don't scream, I'm going to rip something down, right? And I'm like, okay, you know, I feel that way too, only I may not scream. I may actually go and punch my pillow, or like, you know, go and cook up a storm, or like pound my bread dough, you know. So it's really thinking about, you know, how do we explore with people in a way that they feel safe, you know, what their experiences are and what are the tools that they think would work for them, right, as well. You know, does that make sense for folks? And then finally, I think to close, you know, harm reduction allows us to do several things that can also help us to navigate our own trauma and our own, you know, the stuff that we bring, right? Because when we practice healing center engagement and we practice harm reduction, it allows us to release ownership of other people's processes and outcomes, right? This is the person's process. We're here to support them. So success or not success, we throw that out the window, right? We're thinking about what's best for this person. We're honoring, as Laura said the last time, any positive change, right? People's, like, remember the steps, like making sure that we're taking concrete steps and people are being successful. We want people to feel resilient. And that is honoring people's positive change as they define it, right? And we center autonomy and self-determination of every individual, right? And that's going to look different in different circumstances. To me, harm reduction gives us freedom. Freedom not to be perfect, freedom to be human, freedom to say, you know what, I want to learn more about that. I want to understand, I want to support you. That's not my experience. And so I don't know how that feels, but I want you to explain that to me so that I can understand that better and support you better, right? And it also allows us to, you know, como decía mi abuelita, meter las patas, you know, like to trip up and to say, you know what, that didn't work, let me try something else. So it makes us more human. And I think for me, that's the biggest gift that harm reduction gives us. And I know Laura has resources that she wants to share with folks, and I think we can upload them into the folder that Monica has access to, so she can share that with all of you. And I'll upload the tapping, the EFT, and also something else called trauma release exercises, which is something people can do twice a day for 20 minutes, and it's just postures. You don't have to think about your trauma, but it's how your body processes the experience of trauma, and I found really helpful for participants, as well as the breathing that Laura was saying. So we're happy to share that. I think we can do some breathing, right? Maybe like 1 minute of breathing to center ourselves. Would that work?
Go like that to close?
I think so.
Yes. All right. So we'll do last week. We were doing the 4 to 4. Inhale 4, exhale 4. Today, what we're gonna do for this 2 minutes is we're gonna inhale 4, counting to 4, and you try to exhale counting to 5 or 6, whatever you can, because I want to teach you that the longer you exhale, the more you relax. So sit down again and try to be as comfy as you can. You can close your eyes or not. And we'll inhale. That means we expand the belly. And count to 4. Exhale, count to 5. Inhale, count to 4. Exhale, count to 5. Inhale. Exhale. One more exhale. Inhale. Exhale. And we can do the neck before we. I like to do the exorcist, which is you move your head like this. I call it the exorcist. Well, we want to thank you so much for being thought partners and working with us the last 2 sessions. We can always come back, as I say. We have, we do trainings on crisis prevention and de-escalation and a lot of other subcategories of harm reduction work that Tanagra leads. So we want to remind you to stay focused on your body and your needs and to be kind to yourself. And whenever it gets really sassy, be extra kind to yourself. And I don't know, Tanagra, there is any other last minute.
Gracias, everyone. It's been such a pleasure to see your faces. I feel like, I know you now, so we'd love to come back if you'll have us. And feel free to reach out to Laura, to myself, or to Charles if you want any materials or anything else that we've talked about. We're happy to either share with you or find it and share it with you and stay in community with you. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon. Bye, Monica. Bye, Melissa.
Gracias,
Bye,
Monica.
Jasmine.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much. Thank you.
Adios. Bye-bye.
Adios. Para Adios.